Okay, so I started working with Cow Tipping Press the winter of my first year at Macalester College. We have a department called the Civic Engagement Center, and they arrange a lot of volunteer and work opportunities outside the campus community. And one day there was a very, very specific email that was focused on this one thing, which was cow tipping. It said something about social justice and literature, and also something with 90-some% of teachers say they had fun on the job. So I was like, that's an interesting combination of things. And I pulled up some of the electronic versions of the books that Cow Tipping Press had published, and was super excited. I was going, whoa, 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 while I was reading them, and I was at work, so it was kind of weird. But what caught me about the books was the amount of adherence to and deviation from standard English and standard grammar. That's something that I really became interested in when I took a class through the University of Minnesota's College in the Schools program. And I read an article by a professor named Bell Hooks. It was called Teaching to Transgress. And an argument she made was that we shouldn't force individuals to adhere to standard English when writing. It stifles the authenticity of their voices. And that just changed my mind about so many things, because I've always been a big fan of English literature and academic writing. So just to think that it is kind of counter to the purpose of academic study to say you have to follow these rules and not others. So that really kind of was really exciting to see cow tipping stuff, because it was sort of these conceptual things actually in action, in place. So I immediately started working on my application, and then I started teaching. I taught a micro class, which is a 2-week, 2-session class, and then this summer I did a full 5-week class. And now I'm, as a part of my degree, my major at Macalester, I'm doing an internship for credit. So I reached out to Cow Tipping to see if I could keep working with them, to really be involved in what they do on kind of a different end. And yeah, that's how I got here.
So can you say just a little bit about your interests in literature and the kinds of questions that brought you to Macalester?
Okay.
Or that you developed as you studied at Macalester?
A lot of the interests I had were always kind of foundational to kind of the traditional canon. So Austen, with the creation of the novel, was always one of my biggest interest areas, and kind of the feminist commentary that kind of comes and goes with getting into a more romantic era with Jane Eyre and other works like that, seeing what kind of is mainstream and how that will fall by the wayside later. It was during my senior year that I really kind of branched out more, with the same University of Minnesota class, looking at ideas like post-colonial theory and other things like that. And that was when I really kind of broadened more with what I'm interested in, reading books by Toni Morrison and a variety of Native American authors too was really exciting. It definitely kind of informed my interest in American studies when I kind of came to realize that looking at the body of American literature is more than Mark Twain. So works we read Ceremony, Green Grass, Running Water, variety of Sherman Alexie. So that was a kind of a combination of like my 11th grade and 12th grade English. And then since coming to Macalester, I've delved into writing more. I'm currently on the creative writing track. And I think the same interests are still present. Yeah, definitely I'm still interested in kind of looking at like diversifying the canon that we read. Some of that's come with looking for more like independent publishers when I go to read for fun rather than like New York Times bestsellers, which is easy to kind of get caught up in. And yeah, the courses that I'm the most interested in are ones that fall into a category we have, which is writers of color in the diaspora. Something along those lines is kind of, again, like diversifying the canon that many people read in like kind of our sort of like academic circle at school. And yeah, definitely like with writing as well, especially kind of creative nonfiction.
G.E. Moore was asked once if he read novels, and he said, yes, all 6 every year. And by that he meant, of course, Jane Austen.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, I read novels, all of them, yearly. But, I mean, the subtext or whatever of that is that after you've read these things, you can't read other stuff and take it very seriously. And, I mean, few people feel that way about all sorts of things, that they just set a standard of excellence. And, I mean, you started out reading, stuff that's centrally regarded.
Yeah.
And has been for, 100 years regarded as a model.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened to your elitism?
Yeah, I think it has to do with like reading like academic texts surrounding the books I've read. Like I know, like the idea that before Austen, novels were like novels, like they weren't the same, were much more fantastical and unrelatable, and he really kind of paved a new road with making it very relatable to at least a lot more people than they once were before. It wasn't fantastical pirates like kidnapping people and things like this. And then it's weird because later with Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte was criticized for not writing like Austen. So it's just kind of weird how like standards kind of come and go. And I think my response to that is, then like, let's kind of just not have them then. And not to say that like things that have followed are like of any less value, even though that's very much like a kind of like a relative, hard to like, I don't know, I feel like it's a fallacy to really say like this is valuable and this isn't. But yeah, I think it's definitely kind of seeing how things have changed. And I know something that stuck with me was from an NPR podcast. I think it was Fresh Air, the one with all the interviews. They were talking about how The Great Gatsby has kept its relevance more than other works from the time, like Hemingway. And they compared Gatsby to like the MTV series Cribs, and how like it's kind of the same thing. It's just sort of being presented in a different way. So I guess that's kind of ultimately what I think makes something meaningful. And yeah, I know like there are works of literature, like I know like Pilgrim's Progress is like touted as like the most boring of things, and kind of all these like different like perceptions that influence what people decide to read. Some are like problematic, and some I think just reflect just like kind of an innate inability to like relate to things after a certain period of time has passed from their creation. But I don't know, I just think it's just kind of not being narrow, I think, is ultimately more valuable. It's like something I think about with contemporary art. When people are highly critical of contemporary art, I wonder if they are just thinking, oh, I don't want this in my living room, so therefore I don't like it. And yeah, I think everything, it has value, and you don't want to try to derive so much that you treat it like it's the only thing that's out there, because then you're not looking for everything else. So kind of realizing there's no like best, because that's bad for you, and that's like bad for the artistic community if you kind of narrow. So that's something I always try to think about.
I used to accuse my friends in literature and philosophy at Carleton of having so much respect for the books they were studying that after they left the university they would no longer read them. It's like without the sacred priesthood of people, to initiate us properly, and without without all of that frou-frou, just don't feel up to opening these books. And of course that's ultimately, it's a joke, and it's also ultimately a condemnation of a kind of education. If people don't read after they leave your literature courses for whatever reason, you failed.
Yeah.
So, what kind of a reader are you? I mean, not in the courses, but in the summer.
Yeah, in the summer. I think classics, originally very much like English language classics, were kind of like the road I followed, and like trying to diversify that, picking up things that I've heard about through school, like during winter break I read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which was really exciting, and also like it's fun to read translations, even just because like thinking about like the politics of it and what it might be saying that you don't want to say, that wasn't like originally intended to be said. And also reading more from independent presses like Coffee House and Milkweed. I've been a really big fan of a recent book from Milkweed called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is really exciting. It's a really unique book. It's all these ideas that I've never heard anywhere else, and they're all in this one book, and it's very exciting. And yeah, I'm kind of looking more at definitely like 20th century literature rather than like kind of like Victorian and like around like Regency. In English language, like Margaret Atwood has definitely become one of my favorites, and kind of like looking at like the relevance, especially with Handmaid's Tale being made into a series. And yeah, I definitely in like novels and nonfiction. I haven't read much poetry. That's definitely something I kind of often leave untouched, because it's something I'm just not as familiar with, so I'm less inclined to read it, but I feel like it's just like for many reasons I should give it more consideration.
Yeah. So, what's your tell me about your experience at Cow Tipping Press and about what that teaching was like
Okay.
for you.
Yeah, when I first started in the spring semester, I wasn't sure what to expect. Something we do a lot of is we have excerpts and other short readings that inspire prompts in class. So, like, I'll have a couple, like, memoirs for creative nonfiction and a couple poems for poetry. And choosing those was always hard, just because of, like, we would read them together in class. And making things, the balance between having stuff be, like, open-ended and having it kind of focused with a clear direction of, oh, like, this is a poem about, like, mac and cheese. So it was kind of, like, balancing those things, and I wasn't always sure where they would go, and also knowing how long it would take for students to write, and just kind of, like, the logistics. I was very, very focused on those things. And then walking into my first class was super exciting because there were a ton of volunteers and support staff there with the maybe 5 or 6 students. And there was just so much energy, and it was really great because all these, like, staff and volunteers and all the students knew each other really, really well. And they were really happy to be there, and just to kind of, like, share ideas and, like, things they're thinking about. Like, I know, like, I kept finding myself saying, oh, this is something you could write about, this is something you could bring in. And I think the coolest thing in that class was we watched a video of, it was TED, it might have been a TEDx performance of a slam poem called If I Should Have a Daughter, I think it was. And from watching that, we kind of generated this idea of writing letters, or, like, kind of giving wisdom to other people. And kind of, like, it's hard to kind of, like, talk about, like, what is slam poetry. And I think the thing about it that really stuck was kind of this, like, bursting, energetic language that's very expressive, and everyone was very engaged, and I had people share who hadn't wanted to talk yet, and that was really fun. That was super exciting. And then this summer was also really great, having the 5 weeks so we could look at a wider variety of pieces, and we had the amazing opportunity to be at the show gallery with Midwest Special Services. That's where the students were from, and having the gallery space was really cool because we spent a day doing journalism, and one of the exercises we did was like doing an art review or an art critique. So everyone walked around and looked at stuff, and it was really fun just because like, I would watch students, like, look at a thing and then pull aside a volunteer and say, this is why this is so great. And they had so much to say, and would pour it and went and poured it all out. Because I know some students, they were kind of reluctant to go into a lot of detail. So kind of, like, trying new things with writing longer pieces wasn't going as well. But with that exercise, it really, like, there were a lot of sparks happening, which was cool. And then also seeing when students were very adamant about not following the prompt, which was something I was a little too attached to at first. And I kind of changed my mind about it when I talked to Brian, the director, because when he started out creating cow tipping, he would only sit down with people and say, what do you want to say? And that was where they went. Like, it was just from, like, what the students brought into the room. So I definitely tried to incorporate that more. and again, like kind of improving the balance between like the ambiguous and the specific. I know for a few students, they really liked something where I would have a word on an index card, and it'd be something like happy or storm or night, and that would lead to something really cool. It's very specific, but it's also very kind of general. Yeah, and just like the genuine expressions of I like this, I don't like this, made it really unpredictable, but also very fulfilling to see when people really found their niche. And yeah, and kind of like the steps along the way with how we would write. Like sometimes people would write themselves, sometimes the support staff or volunteer would transcribe, and sometimes we would do audio recordings. And yeah, it was just really fun to kind of change up the medium. I know like people would, like there was a lot of like kind of like satisfaction that I could see when people would like have a recording made and then they would play it back for everyone to listen to. Because it's like speaking in front of an audience but not actually doing it. And yeah, like just changing, like the opportunities to kind of change things up, to like experiment and to kind of add to a body of work that is very new. Yeah, like kind of seeing all this like progress and like cool creativity happening in person and being able to kind of guide it was really exciting.
So, what does it take to be a teacher, or what kind of a role, or do you feel most comfortable with as a leader in this particular kind of workshop teaching situation?
I think my biggest thing, and I realized this after my first class, was the better word is facilitator. Just because it's kind of the purpose behind what we do is amplifying the voices of people with developmental disability, and really kind of like bringing those out rather than really like directing anyone. And with prompts and with example readings and with questions, it really is just to kind of like spur ideas. It's not to say, oh, model this. Like some people like to do that, and like if they want to, it's okay. But there's no one way to take something or one way to respond. I think it's really cool when people they see a prompt or an idea and they say, oh, I don't want to do this, but I want to do this. And having that kind of process of inspiration take place is really, really cool. So I think kind of knowing that what you put into it as a teacher is important, but it's not at all about you and necessarily about what you're bringing, as long as like what you bring means something to you. Like I know talking with other teachers, when they've taught genres they're not as interested in, the whole class kind of can tell. Like the energy level falls and students aren't as eager to write. Yeah, and I think something that's important is like having a lot of like energy about people and about watching them and helping them kind of explore things they're interested in, and also there's kind of like a innate like love of words and writing too. So I found that people write a lot. Like the classes have maybe around 6 people. It can vary, but people are writing a lot, and you're hearing things performed, and like I would take stuff home and type it up and bring stuff back to students, and So a lot was coming through, and it was a big eye opener to what it means to teach. But being able to really listen to students when they read or when they ask questions or share ideas, and to give authentic feedback on the spot. It's hard, but I think it's very important to let people know that you really listen to what they said, and being authentic about this is something that I think is really great, and I think that was really important. Something I've talked about with cow tipping and people we've worked with is in kind of like areas where people like neurotypical people are working with people with developmental disabilities. There's often not as much of an arts focus. It's more of a craft focus. Not so much of like self-directed, like original creative work, but kind of working within a very set template. I guess how I understand it. So I think just being supportive at all times, and really seeing people as artists, and a willingness to kind of like look beyond your experiences, or kind of understanding. And it ends up being much more of an exchange than like a teacher-student relationship.
How do you think about the matter of shaping work, the process of revision? Flannery O'Connor famously said something like, "Yeah, squelching beginning writers so they never write again. That's what we do." I'm proud of it. Basically, I'm proud of the people who I kept from continuing. And you can see what that means. But on the other hand, you're after something quite different. Not dealing with people who are going to kill 1 million trees with something that ultimately is not going to work. How do you see your job? How do you see what you do? I won't say critically, but in helping with the revision process in your situation?
Yeah, it's funny because that's really not a big thing we do, and like in each class, people ideally write maybe 3 or 4 pieces, and we teachers and support staff and volunteers trying to kind of keep them going as much as they can. So it's almost very much like a producing a lot, or as much as possible, is always the goal. If someone wants to keep working on one thing, they can keep working on it, or else if they're done, quickly moving on to something else. So just kind of keeping the pencils moving. And revisions aren't they're more kind of preparing for the publications we do for each class, and that's usually, it involves a teacher kind of thinking about formatting, like putting stuff in kind of more of like a prose form, or kind of breaking it up into stanzas. Sometimes it's in a balance between kind of making some like grammatical adjustments, and the idea is balancing keeping the authentic voice of the writer, and then making it more something that a broader audience would be able to kind of take stuff away from and understand. And then with those changes, I would make those changes and kind of put together like a packet of edited, adjusted stuff, and then talk with the student to see what they think and what things they want, ultimately for the book, where each person has maybe four or five pieces. And Yeah, so students will sometimes hold on to stuff, and sometimes bring it back after adding more, sometimes not. And yeah, it's really to inspire people to like keep writing and to kind of do more, especially because we're not like, we don't have this like super set curriculum where this is going to like make you like a quote unquote better writer, or like change how you do this, or it's really kind of, I understand it as a means of kind of helping people like look inward and say, oh, I have these abilities, I can do this, I can write really original, cool, creative things that like reflect my experience or interests. And that's something that's like coming from them and not us. So like in my classes, I just hope to help people find that, and then once the class is done, then like just have fun with it. Like take more classes. We try to connect people with like other kind of opportunities, whether or not designed for people with developmental disabilities or not, if they're interested in it. But yeah, it's always just kind of like a push to like do more and to write more. And I guess if someone wants to go back and change their writing in any big way, it's always very much their call. And yeah, it's a pretty open-ended process.
Has there been any spillover from your experience at cow tipping into your own writing?
I know, it's hard to really separate it all, because I was taking a creative writing class where I was learning a ton of new stuff, just like while learning a ton of new stuff, with cow tipping. But I think something that I've taken away, is kind of like a blending of kind of content and then like the means of presenting it. Sometimes students would have a very like heartwarming, very relatable story, but it would be written in a way that many people would be kind of unfamiliar with. So kind of like in like things that feel more relatable and things that feel more experimental, and kind of like mixing the two has like intrigued me a lot. Yes, and also like there's been ways in which people relate genres to current events, like looking at like politics and like bringing in science fiction kind of ideas is definitely really interesting, because I've had several students who they like to write about real life, and that was something that I kind of had to like come to terms with when presenting genres, especially doing fantasy writing, because a lot of students didn't want to bring in fictional stuff into their pieces, and instead would reflect ideas like time travel, in terms of looking at like the length of their life, and like if I traveled back in time to when I was a little kid or into the future. And yeah, it almost kind of like collapses the genre, and not something that has really influenced me, because I'm also a very realistic writer, but it's something that I've definitely kept in mind.
There's a standard piece of advice for writers. You find it on the Facebook Advice for Writers things all the time, which is that if you want to become a writer, read. Does it work that way for people with developmental disabilities? I mean, are they reading and getting ideas from what they read and trying things out that they find in things they read? How does it work in that case?
I mean, I'm sure it varies a lot. I know in my experience, doing readings in class, it didn't engage people too much. Finding stuff with like the nature of a text so that it's easily understood is kind of a tricky thing to balance. But yeah, it's I think kind of looking at broader ideas for what is a text and what is a work, like a piece of work, how confined is it to a book on a page of a book, because there are so many kind of stories and narratives that students I've had are really familiar with, and they're the same stories and narratives that any neurotypical person out in the community would probably be aware of. A lot of fans of certain kinds of music or of Harry Potter or things like that, where people are really excited about it and energetic and very familiar with all the caveats and details of these stories, and are eager to write about them and reflect them in their work, whether or not we busted out a Harry Potter book and read a passage together. So I think kind of in those ways, people bring in a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff from movies, but I know that was one thing that reading stuff as a group wasn't a huge thing. Sometimes students would look ahead in packets and find things they liked and they would bring them in, or ideas from them, but I found that prompts, questions or one-word prompts, or other kind of very media videos or images, usually were more effective starting point. But kind of from my perspective and time with students, it was kind of hard to tell. I don't really know what everyone's doing in their time outside of class, if they are interested in reading, or if they've kind of decided against it, or if they haven't had the opportunity to really find something that they're interested in. But yeah, so I guess it was kind of open. I'm not really sure where everyone's coming from.
You brought some books along.
Yeah.
You want to say anything about those?
Yeah. Yeah. This was a publication from kind of winter and spring, and this is a publication from my class this summer, and the setup of the books is kind of sort of a typical anthology. It's pretty short. Each student has around 3 pieces. Something that's really exciting in this book that I'm not sure if anyone has done before was when we wrote pieces of we did art review and art criticism. There was a student who was incredibly excited about one picture, and his piece is really great, and I wasn't sure if it was it gives it so much more to have the image with it. So I contacted Midwest Special Services and like the people who work there at the gallery to see if we could like have the artist's permission to like bring their photo in to the book, and they were okay with it. So there's a piece printed alongside an image, which is really fun.
Would you like to read it?
Sure. Okay, the piece is called Merry Christmas. I saw pictures, it feels like Christmas, and we can't see what's going on, but it's fun to pray out there, and I can't how to see fog. It feels like art, and it's so detailed with joy, and brings you a lot of laughter, and it brings you out into the community. Peace on earth and goodwill. Tiding. Temperature. The sun comes out and melts the fog.
Why don't you, if you could hold up the picture so we can see what that is looking like. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other favorites you'd like to read, or just pieces that you would like to talk about?
Oh, okay. One that was really fun. There's a form poem that I learned about in my creative writing class called A Huzzle. It's from kind of the Middle East, and it's pretty simple. It's a series of couplets that have like the last word of the last line of each couplet is the same, more or less the same, and I did it with my first class, and it kind of took a while because it's not something most people are familiar with, but just the idea of like a repeating thing, or like repeating something that's important to you stuck, and a lot of people went with it. And someone did that in class, and he even brought in some things that he overheard that day that he thought were fun, and things from an example I came up with. Like his repeating word is the one I used for the example I gave in class. So it just kind of really shows this like students' interest in like drawing from everything, like from like things on a page, from things someone said, from things you overheard that weren't even necessarily meant to directly influence the writing. It was just something he heard. And yeah, I can read this one. It's untitled. Oh my Atlanta, someone ate the plate of cake, no one is looking, cake. My brother and me like to eat cake. I went to the store and bought some cake for the holiday to celebrate John F. Kennedy. Cake, 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 cake.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.